The sun, a relentless ball of fire, beat down on the arid Arizona plains, baking the earth into a cracked, unforgiving canvas. Samuel Turner, a man whose skin was as weathered as the maps he meticulously crafted, squinted against the glare. Beside him, Thomas, his young assistant, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his clean-shaven face already streaked with dust. The year was 1873, and they had been hired for a job that promised both a handsome sum and a great deal of solitude, to survey the vast, uncharted land belonging to the Blackwood family. "You said it was a family, Samuel?" Thomas asked. "Thin. That's what the letter said. A Mr. Jedediah Blackwood." Samuel is fixed in silhouette of a large, two-story, reclusive they keeps to themselves. "We'll be in and out in a month, maybe less." The homestead stood in stark contrast to the surrounding emptiness, a fortress of weathered timber and faded paint, surrounded by a high, crudely built fence. As they approached, the air grew heavy, not just with the heat, but with a palpable, unsettling stillness. No chickens pecked at the dust, no dogs barked a warning. The only sound was the groan of the wind as it whipped through a lone, gnarled tree near the house. A tall, gaunt man emerged from the shadows of the porch. Jedediah Blackwood was dressed in a simple, dark suit, his face a mask of severe piety. His eyes, a startling pale blue, seemed to bore into them, dissecting their intentions, their very souls. "You've come?" His voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The surveyors. I am Jedediah." "Samuel Turner at your service," Samuel extending a hand. Jedediah ignored it, his gaze fixed on a point just past Samuel's shoulder. "The land is as the good Lord made it," Jedediah intoned. "Our purpose is to live by His word, not to tamper with creation." "We're just here to map it, sir," Thomas interjected, a nervous tremor, to make sure everything is in order. Jedediah finally turned his eye to Thomas, a flicker of something unreadable. Contempt? Amusement? Order? "Yes, we have that here. The Lord provides." As if on cue, a woman appeared in the doorway behind him. She was young, no more than 20, her face a pale, ghostly oval framed by long, dark hair. Her eyes, identical to Jedediah's in color and intensity, were wide and vacant. She clutched a worn Bible to her chest, her belly a prominent, rounded mouth. Then another woman, and another, and another, 5 in total, all of them young, all of them pale, and all of them visibly, deeply pregnant. They stood in a silent, unwavering line, their gazes fixed on the newcomers, with an eerie, collective stillness. Samuel felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen plenty of strange things in the West, but this was different. This wasn't just isolation. It was a deliberate, cultivated strangeness. Thomas, beside him, seemed to have frozen in place, his mouth slightly agape. "These are my daughters," Jedediah said, his voice laced with a possessive pride. "Alara, Sarah, Leah, Rachel, and Mary. They are the Lord's vessels. They carry His will." The words hung in the oppressive air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Samuel's mind raced, searching for a rational explanation. A religious sect? A community with a shared belief system? He told himself it was just a strange family, isolated by their belief. But the feeling of unease persisted, a slow, creeping dread that had nothing to do with the heat or the dust. They set up their camp a safe distance from the house, a small tent pitched beneath the shade of the gnarled. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the plains, Samuel and Thomas began to survey the perimeter. The land was flat, featureless, a blank slate of dirt and scrub brush. But as they walked, Samuel noticed something odd. The Blackwood homestead wasn't simply surrounded by a fence. It was defined. The fence was built not in a perfect square, but with subtle, almost imperceptible curves, as if tracing an unseen boundary. "You see that," Samuel muttered to Thomas, pointing to a slight curve in the wooden posts. "It's off. It's not a straight line. Maybe they just built it crooked," his voice dismissive. He was still rattled by the sight of the 5 pregnant women. "No, it's too deliberate," Samuel insisted. "It follows something, a natural rise in the land, a depression, or something else." As night fell, they returned to their camp. A single lantern glowed from the Blackwood house, a lonely beacon in the immense darkness. The air was cool now, but the oppressive stillness remained. Samuel found it difficult to sleep. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. Jedediah's chilling pronouncements, the vacant, haunted eyes of the 5 daughters. He felt a deep, instinctive wrongness, a feeling he couldn't articulate. At one point, he heard a soft, rhythmic scraping from the direction of. He crept out of the tent, his pistol clutched in his hand. The moonlight cast a pale glow on the yard. One of the daughters, Ilara, was kneeling near the fence, her pregnant belly a dark mouth. She was scraping a small stick against a wooden post, over and over, in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Samuel watched, a cold dread washing over him. Was she drawing something? A pattern? She stopped suddenly and looked up, her gaze locking directly with his. Her eyes, even in the dim light, held a chilling intensity. She held a finger to her lips, a gesture, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she scraped the stick against the post one last time, leaving a faint, jagged line. As she did, a tremor ran through the ground beneath Samuel's feet, a subtle vibration that faded as quickly as it came. She stood up and retreated into the house without a sound, leaving Samuel alone in the vast, silent darkness. The image of her face burned into his mind. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he and Thomas were not just here to survey land. They had stumbled into a place where the lines between the natural and the unnatural were dangerously blurred, a place where secrets were buried, not in the ground, but in the hearts of a family lost to the wild frontier. This is just the beginning. The secrets of the Blackwood family are buried deep, and every chapter will bring Samuel and Thomas closer to a truth they may not want to. Be sure to subscribe to see how this chilling tale unfolds. The next morning, a thin, hazy light filtered through the dust-choked air. Samuel woke feeling unrested, the image of Ilara's silent plea still vivid in his mind. He didn't mention it to Thomas, not yet. The young man was already on edge, and Samuel didn't want to be the one to confirm his fears. They began their work in earnest, trudging across the sun-scorched earth with their transits and chains. The house, from a distance, looked like a mirage, a fragile bastion against the emptiness. As they worked, Samuel began to notice more of the subtle, disturbing oddity. The Blackwood daughters would sometimes appear at the windows, their pale faces framed by the dark glass, watching their every move. They moved with a synchronized, almost unnatural grace, their movements slow and deliberate. There was no sound from the house at all, save for the occasional low hum that seemed to emanate from within. It was a sound Samuel couldn't place, not a song, not a machine, but a continuous low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. During their lunch break, a young boy no older than 10 approached them. He was small and wiry, with the same pale eye, but his face was smudged with dirt, his clothes ragged. He carried a small bag of dried meat. "Father said you should have this," the boy said, his voice a soft, reedy whisper. "Thank you, son," Samuel said, taking the... "What's your name?" The boy's eyes darted nervously to the... "They call me Caleb." "Do you live here, Caleb?" Caleb nodded, but a look of terror flashed. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They listen. Always. The walls have ears." He gestured toward the house, his small hand trembling. "The ground. It remembers everything." Before Samuel could ask more, a sharp, authoritative voice echoed from the... "Caleb, back to your duties." Jedediah stood on the porch, a dark, imposing figure. The boy flinched, dropped his head, scurried away without another word. The encounter left Samuel and deeply unsettled. The boy's words, though cryptic, confirmed their growing suspicion. Something was terribly wrong here. That evening, as they reviewed their measurement, Samuel noticed a peculiar anomaly. The curvature of the fence, which he had initially dismissed, was mirrored by the faint, nearly invisible lines of an old, long-forgotten foundation beneath the ground. He traced the lines on his map, and a chilling pattern began to emerge. The homestead was built not in a rational rectangular shape, but in an elongated oval, a shape that eerily resembled a human womb. "Look at this, Thomas. The house, the fence, it's all laid out like a coffin or a cradle. It's not just random." Thomas stared at the map, a look of growing horror on his face. "What are you saying, Samuel? That this whole place is some kind of ritual?" Samuel didn't answer. He was preoccupied with another thought. The sound he'd heard that first night, the rhythmic scraping of the stick. He remembered the jagged line Ilara had drawn. He pulled out the map, found the exact spot where he'd been standing, and compared it to the layout. The line she had drawn, he realized, a sickening lurch, corresponded to the corner of what appeared to be an old, buried structure, one that was on any of the original land deed. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible, cloying, earthy odor that reminded Samuel of damp soil and something else, and old. He looked up at the Blackwood house. All the lights were out now, but in the deep silence he could hear it again, the low, continuous hum, as if the very ground beneath them was vibrating with some terrible, long-held secret. They were not just mapping land, they were mapping a grave. The days that followed were a tense, silent dance. Samuel and Thomas worked methodically, their movements precise and deliberate. They spoke little, their communication limited to hushed wit and quick, knowing glances. Their attention was no longer on the land alone, but on the Blackwoods themselves. They observed the family's strange rituals, the daughters moving in a line to the small, overgrown garden, their hands working the soil with a silent, almost robotic efficiency. They watched Jedediah patrol the perimeter of the house, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his movements those of a man guarding a precious, terrible secret. One afternoon, while taking measurements near an old, dried-up well, Samuel noticed a loose stone. He knelt down and, with a careful shove, dislodged it. Behind it was a small, crudely carved object. It was a doll made of old cloth and straw, its face a simple knot of thread. It was old, discolored, and held a small, desiccated piece of paper in its hand. The paper was brittle, and as Samuel carefully unfolded it, the words were faint but legible. "Please for help." The rest of the words were too faded to read. But the message was clear. Someone had been here before them. Someone had tried to leave a message. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. This was not a religious commune. This was a prison. He showed the doll and the note to Thomas. The young man's face. Who would leave this? What did they mean? "I don't know," Samuel said, his mind racing, "but it tells me that we are not the first, and it tells me that someone, somewhere, is desperately trying to tell us what is happening." They hid the doll in their satchel, the secret now a tangible object. As they continued their survey, they discovered more anomalies. There were no paths leading away from the homestead, only faint, overgrown trails leading deeper into the surrounding desert. The Blackwoods were not just isolated, they were cut off, their world confined to the boundaries of the strange, womb-like fence. That evening, a storm began to brew on the sky, which had been a clear, relentless blue, turned a bruised purple. The wind began to howl, and the first drops of rain, heavy and cold, began. The Blackwood homestead, usually so still and silent, now seemed to be a hive of frantic activity. Jedediah stood on the porch, his arms raised to the sky as if in defiance of the coming storm. The daughters rushed about, securing windows, their faces pale with a kind of fear Samuel had not yet seen. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The wind howled, and the lone gnarled tree near their camp shook violently. Samuel saw it, a small, dark figure running from the house, a desperate, hunched form making for the fence. It was the young boy, Caleb. Samuel and Thomas watched as Jedediah's furious voice cut through the storm. "Caleb, back inside. The Lord's judgment is upon us." The boy didn't stop. He scrambled over the fence and began to run into the desert, his small form swallowed by the rain and the gathering darkness. Jedediah, a man of surprising speed, gave chase, his long legs devouring the ground. Samuel and Thomas, driven by a shared, unspoken impulse, followed. The chase was a desperate, chaotic blur. The rain turned the dusty ground to mud, and the wind whipped around them, blinding them. Samuel and Thomas were not as fast as Jedediah, who seemed to be propelled by a terrifying, righteous rage. They saw him catch the boy, his hand clamping down on Caleb's small arm. Jedediah dragged him back towards his words lost in the sound of the storm, but his intent clear. "That's enough, Jedediah," Samuel shouted, breaking the unwritten rule of their neutrality. Jedediah paused, turning his head. His eyes, in the sudden light of a flash of lightning, were pure, unadulterated madness. He was no longer a pious man. He was a monster. He let go of the boy, who crumpled to the ground, sobbing. Jedediah stared at Samuel, his face contorted in a silent snarl, and then turned back to the house, dragging the boy behind him. The storm raged on. The terror that now settled over Samuel and Thomas had nothing to do with the weather. They had seen the true face of Jedediah Blackwood, and they knew with chilling certainty that they were no longer just observers. They were now witnesses, and they were in very real danger. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving the plains cool and the air clean, but the cleansing rain had done nothing to wash away the terror of the previous night. Samuel and Thomas returned to their camp, shaken, and they knew they had to leave, but something held them back. The doll, the note, the fear in Caleb's eyes. They couldn't simply turn their backs on it. They had to know what was happening inside that house. The next morning, Ilara, the oldest of the daughters, approached their camp. She moved slowly, her hands clasped over her belly. She was alone. Jedediah was nowhere to be seen. Her eyes, still holding that same vacant terror, now also held a spark of something else, determination. She held out a small leather-bound book. "Take it." Her voice a dry, papery, "Read and understand." Before Samuel could react, she turned and walked back to the house, a silent, ghostly figure fading into the morning light. Samuel opened the book. It was a diary, its pages brittle with age. The ink faded in places. The handwriting was neat, precise, and belonged to a woman named Abigail Blackwood. The first entries were from 40 years ago, chronicling a different time, a time of hope. Abigail wrote about her love for a man named Josiah, a kind and gentle man, and her joy at the birth of their first child. The diary was a testament to a life of quiet happiness, a life of simple pleasures. But the entries began to change, the tone shifting from joy to a growing unease. She wrote of Jedediah, Josiah's brother, who had arrived at the homestead. Jedediah, she was a man of stern and unyielding faith, a man who believed the world was a den of sin, and the only way to salvation was through absolute purity and obedience. The entries grew darker. Abigail wrote of Jedediah's influence over Josiah, of how he began to twist his brother's mind, convincing him that their family was a chosen line, a special seed that must be kept pure, untainted by the outside world. She wrote of Jedediah's obsession with a specific passage from the Bible, one he interpreted as a divine directive to keep their bloodline isolated and pure. Then came the entries that made Samuel's blood run cold. Abigail wrote of her daughters, all 5 of them, born to her and Josiah, and then an entry from 30 years ago. Jedediah says it is the will of the Lord. The girls must not leave. The seed must be cultivated. The rest of the page was a frantic scrawl of gibberish, as if the pen had been snatched from her hand. The last entry was simple, a final desperate plea. He says the children must be born of the family, the lineage must not be broken. Forgive me, my sweet daughters. Forgive me for not being strong enough to save you from this unholy purpose. Samuel closed the book, his hands trembling. The words were a hammer blow to his soul. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a horrifying finality. The 5 pregnant women, their identical features, the seclusion, the twisted religion. The daughters were pregnant with the children of their own kin, the result of a perverted, decades-long scheme to create a pure bloodline, an abomination born of one man's madness. Thomas, who had been reading over his shoulder, let out a shaky "God," his voice full of revulsion. He's a monster. The diary explained the eerie similarities between the daughters, the way they moved in unison. It wasn't a product of shared belief. It was the result of a shared, generations-long horror. They were not sisters, but clones, their lives a cycle of terror, It explained the note, and the boy's desperate. Caleb was not just a boy. He was a child of this twisted lineage, and he had been trying to escape this. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the house. "Thomas! Samuel! Jedediah requests your presence." It was one of the daughters, her voice a hollow echo of the one in the diary. Samuel and Thomas looked at each other, a shared, silent understanding passing between them. They had what they needed. They had the evidence. Now they had to get out. But they knew with a certainty that chilled them to the bone that Jedediah Blackwood had no intention. They made their decision quickly and silently. There was no time to pay. They grabbed their essential tools, the diary clutched tightly in Samuel's hand, and began to move. They didn't run, not at first. They walked, trying to maintain an air of normalcy as they headed toward the edge of the Blackwood property, their hearts hammering in their chests. They could feel his eyes on them. Jedediah's presence was a palpable, oppressive weight. They knew he was watching from the house, a predator observing his prey, waiting for the first sign of fear, the first moment of flight. They reached the fence, the same one Samuel had surveyed so meticulously. He scrambled over the wooden posts, feeling like the bars of a cage he had just. Thomas followed, his movements clumsy with panic. As soon as they were on the other side, they began to run, the dry earth kicking up with every frantic. A piercing, guttural roar echoed behind them. It wasn't a human sound. It was the howl of an animal, a beast unleashed. Samuel risked a glance over his shoulder. Jedediah stood at the fence, his dark figure silhouetted against the setting sun. But he wasn't alone. The 5 daughters stood beside him, their faces impassive, and in their arms they held something small and wrapped in blankets. The children. Jedediah was not just a murderer. He was a twisted patriarch, a perversion of a father, and he would not let them leave with his secret. The chase was on. Samuel and Thomas ran until their lungs burned, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at their heels. Jedediah, with his long, tireless stride, gained on them, his figure a relentless, unholy specter in the distance. He knew this land. He had walked its every inch for 30 years, and he was as much a part of it as the dusty soil and the gnarled trees. They found a temporary refuge in a small rocky outcrop, a natural fortress against the relentless plains. They huddled behind a large boulder, their chests heaving, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They could hear his footsteps now, a slow, methodical crunch on the gravel. "He's not running," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. He's hunting us." "He knows we have the diary," Samuel said, his voice low and tight. "He knows what we know. He won't stop until he gets it back." They waited, listening to the sounds of the night, the low howl of the wind, the distant cry of a coyote, and the relentless approaching footstep. Jedediah didn't call out, didn't shout. He was a silent hunter, a man who saw no need for words. He was simply an instrument of his own deranged purpose. A few hours later, the footsteps stopped. Samuel and Thomas held their breath. Silence, a terrifying, absolute silence, and then a sound from above, a scraping of rock against rock. Jedediah was on the ridge above them. He had outmaneuvered them, using his intimate knowledge of the land to circle around and trap them. "Come out, surveyors!" His voice, when it finally came, was a soft, chilling whisper carried on the wind. "You have seen what you should not see. You have heard you should not hear. The Lord's will cannot be challenged. Give me the book, and your punishment will be swift and merciful." Samuel held the diary tighter, its leather cover slick with sweat. He knew what merciful meant to a man like Jedediah. It meant a quick death, and then the burial of another secret in the dusty soil of the Arizona plains. The hunt was no longer a chase. It was a siege. They were trapped, with a man who was no longer a man, but a personification of the very land he inhabited, a guardian of a terrible, unholy legacy. Their only way out was to find a way to outsmart him, to use their knowledge of the world he had abandoned against the darkness They spent the night in the small rocky crevice, shivering not from the cold, but from the bone-deep terror of being hunted. Jedediah remained on the ridge, a silent, unmoving. He was playing a waiting game, a game he knew he would win. He had no need for food or water. His purpose was all he required. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows, they heard it. A low, mournful. It came from the direction of the house. A child crying. It was a sound that broke through the oppressive silence. A sound of raw, unadulterated. "One of the babies," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of fear and sorrow. They're alive." The sound seemed to energize Samuel, the children. He had to think of them. They were not just victims of a madman, but new lives, innocent beings trapped in a cycle of horror. He had to get to a town, to a sheriff, to someone who could help them. He looked at Thomas, the young man's face pale and drawn, his idealism replaced with a grim, exhausted reality. "We can't just wait here," Samuel said, his voice a low growl. "He'll find a way down. We need a diversion." They had to use what they knew about Jedediah's mind against him. They had the diary, the proof of his twisted ideology. Jedediah's power, his control, lay in the silence, in the isolation. He was a man who lived by his own rule, a man who saw no sin in his actions because they were sanctioned by his own perverted interpretation of. Samuel's eyes fell on their surveying tools, their transit, the symbols of a world of reason, order, and civilization, a world that Jedediah had long ago abandoned. He had an idea, a desperate, dangerous gamble. The maps, the one we were making. We have to show him we still have it. But we'll lead him away from the homestead. We'll lead him into a trap. Thomas looked at him, a flicker of hope. A trap? We don't have any weapons, Samuel. Just that pistol with 2 bullets. We don't need a weapon, Samuel. We need his obsession. He wants to keep his secret buried. We will use that to our advantage. They waited for the sun to rise fully, and then, with a silent, shared nod, they began to move. They left their cover, leaving a clear trail behind them, heading not toward a town, but deeper into the barren, uncharted territory. They walked openly, deliberately, and a moment later, they heard the telltale crunch of footsteps behind them. Jedediah had taken the bait. He followed them for hours, a relentless shadow on the horizon. He was a silent tracker, his movements economical and precise. They knew he was waiting for them to tire. A mistake. As the sun reached its zenith, they came to a small, deep ravine, a fissure in the earth that had been carved out by years of flash floods. It was a dead end. Samuel and Thomas looked at each other. This was their spot. They climbed down into the ravine, a deep, narrow trench that offered some cover. Jedediah's footsteps stopped at the edge. Samuel knew he was looking down at them, a triumphant snarl on his face. "You have nowhere to go, surveyors." His voice echoed off the canyon walls, a chilling symphony of madness. "The Lord has led you to your final resting." "We have the diary, Jedediah," Samuel shouted, holding it up for him to see. "And we have your secret, your daughters, your children. They are not a blessing from God. They are a perversion." Jedediah's face, a mask of cold piety for so long, finally broke. A look of pure, unadulterated rage contorted his features. He began to descend the canyon wall, his movements quick and sure. This was not a chase anymore. This was a confrontation. The man who had hidden his perversion for 30 years was finally ready to face the men who had uncovered it. The air in the ravine was thick with tension and the smell of dry earth. Jedediah descended the rocky slope with surprising agility, his long legs finding purchase on the uneven terrain. His face was no longer a mask of piety. It was a road map of pure animalistic fury. "You blaspheme," he growled, his voice echoing. "You dare to question the generation, the lineage. It is all part of his divine plan, a pure, untainted line to carry his word into the future." "This isn't God's will, Jedediah," Samuel, his voice a mix of defiance and fear. "This is a perversion. You have imprisoned your family. You have twisted their lives into a nightmare. You are a madman." Jedediah's eyes, chilling orbs, narrowed in. "You know nothing of my purpose. My brother Josiah was weak. He was a man of this world. He would have let the sin of society corrupt our line. I saved them. I saved us all. He was a man who had built an entire world on a foundation of his own madness, a world so self-contained and so convincing that he had forgotten it was a prison of his own making. He saw no sin in what he had done. He saw only an act of righteous salvation." Samuel took a step back, the diary clutched tightly in his hand. "Abigail knew the truth, Jedediah. She wrote it all down. She knew what you were doing was wrong." At the mention of her name, Jedediah's fury reached a fever pitch. He lunged, a sudden, surprising burst of speed. Samuel, caught off guard, stumbled backward. Jedediah's hands, long and thin, like a bird's talons, clamped down on his shoulders. He was surprisingly strong, his grip like a vice. Abigail was a fool, his face inches from Samuel's. She was blinded by the devil's whispers. She would have let a corrupted seed rot our family from the inside out. Thomas, seeing Samuel in danger, acted on instinct. He grabbed a heavy rock, swung it, catching Jedediah squarely on the side of the... Jedediah grunted, the impact in his grip. He stumbled backward, dazed, and Samuel broke. The moment of their escape was brief. Jedediah, a man of incredible resilience, recovered quickly. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes held a renewed, terrifying clarity. He was no longer a man. He was a machine of a single, terrible purpose. "You will not leave this place," his voice a low, terrifying growl. "You will become one with the earth. Your bones will be the foundation of a new generation." He lunged again, but this time Samuel was ready. He moved to the side, and Jedediah, fueled by his own single-minded rage, went past him, his momentum carrying him toward the edge of. This is the point of no return. The secret is out, and the madman will stop at nothing to bury it again. The struggle is far from over. If you've been captivated by this chilling tale, don't miss a single moment of the final chapter. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion of this shocking mystery. The air, which had so recently been thick with the sound of their frantic flight and the furious chase, now held a profound, unsettling stillness. Jedediah's body lay crumpled at the bottom of the ravine. A broken effigy of the monster pursued them. His angular limbs were contorted at unnatural angles, a final fittingly grotesque form for a man who had twisted so many lives. Samuel and Thomas stood at the edge, their legs trembling, their lungs burning from the sheer exertion. The relief was not a joyous shout, but a physical ache, a sudden, almost disorienting release of tension that left them weak and dizzy. But beneath it was a chilling hollowness, a dawning realization that the true horror was not over. The man was gone, but the darkness he had created lingered, an invisible toxic fog settling over the land. The silence that followed was absolute, a profound void after the storm of their confrontation, punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. They climbed down cautiously, their boots scraping on the loose rock and dry soil. The journey down was a careful, deliberate descent, a descent into the reality of what they had just done. The silence was unnerving. There was no victory cry, no sense of triumph, only a grim, sober finality. Samuel knelt beside the body, the acrid smell of dust and blood heavy, and he pressed 2 fingers to Jedediah's neck, a professional's action, and felt nothing. The man's pale, chilling eyes were wide open, staring at the empty sky, a final, unseeing gaze into the void he had created. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground, a final dying echo of the unnerving hum that had tormented them since their arrival. It was as if the very earth itself, too, was sighing, finally free from the weight of Jedediah's. He's dead. His voice thin with shock and a tremor of both relief and terror. He looked at the leather-bound diary in Samuel's hand, as if the book itself held the power that had just ended. The secret dies with him. Samuel stood up, the leather of the diary slick with sweat. He looked at the homestead in the distance, a dark smudge against the setting sun. The house was not just a collection of wood and nails. It was a monument, not to a single man's death, but to the lives he had stolen. The secret was not a book or a man or even a crime. It was a living, breathing thing, locked behind the walls of that house. The terror wasn't over. It had merely shifted its form. They were no longer the hunted, they were the rescuers, and that, in a way, was far more terrifying. The weight of this new responsibility settled on their shoulders, a burden they hadn't asked for, but could not ignore. They began the long, quiet walk back, their steps heavy with a newfound. The weight of their experience settled over them, a crushing reality that had replaced the fear. They were no longer just surveyors, they were witnesses to a crime. And now they were the only ones who could bring justice to the Blackwood family. They needed to get to a town, to a sheriff, to someone who could help. The world they had left behind now felt a million miles, a distant memory of a normal life they might never fulfill. As they neared their camp, she was a silent, ghostly figure. It was Ilara, her face a pale oval in the dim light, her eyes a wide, fragile hope. She was holding a small, bundled child's face obscured by a blanket. I saw him fall, her voice a soft, tremulous of paper. I was watching from the ridge. He's gone? He's gone, Samuel confirmed, his voice gentle. You're free. A flicker of emotion, relief, grief, and a dawning, terrible understanding crossed her. It was as if decades of repressed feeling were to surface at once. She looked down at the child in her arms, a small bundle of blanketed humanity, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a clean, straight line, and it was the first tears had seen, and it was more powerful than any scream. It was a silent testament of a dam finally broke. He said he was doing God's work. Her voice choked with. He said he was protecting us, but it was just a cage built on lies. He made us believe the world was a den of sin, but the only sin was here, with him. Hilara explained everything in a halting rut of words. The daughters were not just sisters, they were all her children, the result of a horrifying cyclical ritual. Jedediah had been both their patriarch and their father. And in a chilling revelation she revealed that the father of her firstborn had been her own brother, Jedediah's first son, a man who had died years ago. His name erased from the family's history. Her brother had been both a victim and a perpetrator. His life a tragic footnote in his father's monstrous plan. The boy, Caleb, was her son, a child who, like a plant fighting for the sun, had instinctively known something was wrong and had tried to escape. She told them that the other daughters were in the house, paralyzed by a fear so profound it had become a part of their very identity. For 30 years, Jedediah had systematically erased their identities, their personalities, their very sense of self. He had created a twisted world where the outside was a place of sin and corruption, and their seclusion was a form of holy salvation. They were no longer women, they were vessels, their lives reduced to a single terrible function. They are waiting, Hilara said, her eyes fixed on the dark, silent house, waiting for the next stage of his plan. They don't know he's dead, they don't know what to do without his guidance. They are trapped in their own minds. Samuel looked at Thomas. Their mission had changed. They were no longer just seeking to expose a crime. They were the last hope for a family of victims. They were the ones who had to lead them out of the mental and physical prison Jedediah had built. The house, which had once filled them with such terror, was now a sanctuary of trauma, a place where they had to confront a family of walking ghosts and convince them that a world existed beyond the dust and the walls, a world that was waiting to offer them a new beginning. They realized they were not just surveyors of land, but surveyors of the human soul. They were mapping a new future for a family that had been lost for 30 years. The setting sun painted the sky in a palette of deep reds and oranges, a color of a fresh wound. With Hilara as their guide, Samuel and Thomas approached the homestead. The house, which had once seemed like a fortress of silent malevolence, now looked like a monument to a terrible tragedy. Its windows were like vacant eyes staring into the abyss of its own history. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. The front door creaked open with a mournful groan, a sound that seemed to echo the long-suffering cries of those trapped within. It felt like entering a tomb. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of old dust, confinement, and unwashed bodies. It was a smell of a life lived in stasis, of a world that had not changed in decades. In the main room, the 5 daughters were a silent, motionless tableau. They were seated in a semicircle, their faces pale and their eyes empty, their pregnant bellies a grotesque, swollen monument to their shared horror. They looked less like human beings and more like statues, frozen in a moment of perpetual dread, their hands clasped in their laps, their eyes fixed on nothing. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint rhythmic rocking of one of the women, as if trying to soothe an invisible pain. "Jedediah is gone," Samuel said, his voice gentle but firm, cutting through the oppressive silence. "He is dead. You are free." The words seemed to hang in the air, a foreign language in a place where only silence and obedience had reigned for so long. The daughters stared at them, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. They had never known a world without Jedediah's authority. His absence was not a liberation. It was a terrifying, incomprehensible void. For them, Jedediah was not just a father, he was a god, a universe, and without him their world had ceased to exist. They had been so thoroughly broken that freedom was just another word for chaos. They didn't know how to exist without his will guiding them. "He can't be," one of them, Sarah, whispered, her voice a hollow echo of a long-lost personality. "He is the Lord's messenger. He is eternal. He said he would never leave us. He was just a man," his voice full of a heartbreak sincerity. He held up the diary, its pages brittle and yellowed. "A man who twisted the Bible to justify his own sickness. The children you carry are not blessings from God. They are the result of a crime, a terrible, terrible crime. He laid the diary on the rough-hewn table. Ilera took it and, with hands that were now surprisingly steady, placed it in the center. The sight of the small, worn book seemed to finally break through the decades of indoctrination. It was a physical, undeniable piece of truth in a world built on lies. One by one, the daughters' eyes fell on the diary. The blank masks of their faces began to crack. A shudder ran through Leah, and she began to sob, a quiet, guttural sound that soon became a torrent of grief. Rachel followed, and then Mary. The sound of their collective weeping filled the house, a long overdue requiem for their stolen lives. It was the sound of a world shattering, a dam breaking, and the release of 30 years of silent suffering. As they cried, something incredible happened. Their faces, which had been so eerily identical in their stillness, began to differentiate. The blankness was replaced by a range of emotions: grief for what they had lost, anger at the man who had stolen their life, terror at the unknown future, and a fragile, nascent hope. They were no longer a single uniform entity. They were 5 separate women, each with her own pain, her own history, and her own story to tell. Their individual personalities, buried for decades, began to surface like fragile seedlings pushing up through concrete. They were coming back to Ilera, the oldest and strongest, took her sister. "We are no longer his vessels," her voice filled with a newfound strength. "We are survivors, and we have to be strong for our children." The reckoning had begun. The truth, once a hidden secret, was now a shared pain, a trauma that had to be confronted and healed. Samuel and Thomas knew their work was not yet done. They had to help these women, to guide them, to show them a world they had only ever been told was a place of sin and corruption. They were not just rescuers, they were guides, shepherds leading a lost flock to a new life. They sat with the women for hours, listening to their fragmented, terrifying stories, piecing together the true, full extent of Jedediah's crimes. The next morning, as the sun rose over the homestead, a new kind of sound filled the air. It was a sound of life, the crying of the children, their innocent voices cutting through the somber silence, the soft, healing voices of the women speaking to each other, not in hushed whispers, but in open, honest words. They were sharing names, memories, and the silence of the homestead was finally and beautifully broken. Samuel and Thomas began to prepare for the long journey back. They had a long road ahead of them, a journey of both distance and healing. They would take the women and the children to the nearest town, to the sheriff, to the authorities. They would tell their story. They would find them help, a doctor, a new life. The evidence was in the diary, in the women's stories, and in the tragic, beautiful lives. The Blackwood homestead, once a place of deep psychological horror, now stood as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was no longer a cage, it was a ghost, a reminder of a darkness that had been vanquished not by a monster, but by the slow, difficult process of truth and empathy. Their journey had not just been to map land, but to map a new path for a family that had been lost for generations. The journey back to civilization was slow and arduous, a long procession across the vast, unforgiving plains. It was a journey measured not in miles, but in the slow, painstaking steps of a family learning to walk again. Samuel and Thomas walked alongside the Blackwood women and their children, their own bodies tired, their minds exhausted, but their hearts filled with a profound sense. For the first time in their lives, the women were experiencing the world beyond their homes. They marveled at the simplest things, the fleeting sight of a path, the distant rumble of its wind, the sound of a bird's song that wasn't a mournful call. They crouched down to touch the cold, fresh water, their hands trembling, sensation of something so pure and untainted. Their initial fear was slowly, painstakingly, being replaced by a fragile but undeniable sense of wonder. Each new sensation was a small, quiet victory against the decades of Jedediah's psychological warfare. The children, too young to understand the horror they were born into, simply clung to their mothers, their faces a blank slate of pure, unadulterated innocence. They were the future, the fragile new beginning, born from the ashes of a generations-long nightmare. Samuel and Thomas took turns carrying Caleb, the boy who had so bravely tried to. He no longer looked terrified. His eyes, once filled with a panicked desperation, now held a quiet curiosity as he watched the world unfold before him. He was a symbol of hope, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit can seek out the light. They reached the nearest town, a small, dusty outpost called Redemption, late in the afternoon. The name of the town, once a simple geographical label, now felt like a profound prophetic truth. A bustling main street, people walking freely and talking loudly, was overwhelming for them. They clung to each other, their faces a mix of terror and awe. Samuel and Thomas guided them through the streets, a quiet detective force in the face of the town's curious stares. They took them directly to the sheriff, a grizzled, no-nonsense man named Sheriff Brody, his face a roadmap of a life spent in the unforgiving West. They told him. Samuel, voice hoarse from the weight of laid out the diary, the maps, and the horrifying truth. Sheriff Brody listened, expression a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. He looked at the women, their pale faces and their identical, haunted eyes, and the doubt in his expression was replaced by a grim, hard He knew a crime when he saw one, and this was a crime on a scale he had never imagined. It was a story that defied all logic, a narrative so twisted it was hard to believe. But the living evidence was right there, sitting in his office, a testament to the perversion of human nature. He took the women into his care, his voice gentle despite his rugged exterior, promising them a doctor, a home, and the chance to start over. He promised them a future. He would send out a team to the Blackwood homestead to verify the story, to retrieve Jedediah's body, and to officially close a chapter of unspeakable cruelty. The terror had ended, and the long, difficult process of healing was about to begin. As Samuel and Thomas prepared to leave, a wave of weariness washed over them. They were no longer the men who had set out on a simple surveying job. They were changed, their understanding of the world irrevocably altered. They had stumbled into a darkness, but they had also been a conduit for light. Their professional duty had become a moral obligation, and their own lives had been forever marked by the horrifying, powerful story they had uncovered. Ilara approached them, her eyes, once vacant, now filled with a deep, abiding gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than it had ever been. "You came to map land, but you found us. You brought us home." Samuel smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "We were just doing our job," he said, but he knew it was more than that. The story of the Blackwood family, the daughters of a man who had twisted faith into a weapon of control, became a legend in the Wild West, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires and in dusty saloons. It was a story not of ghosts or monsters, but of the very real, very human capacity for cruelty and madness. It was a story of how secrets left to fester in isolation can become a prison. Years later, Samuel and Thomas would continue their work as surveyors, their lives forever marked by the time they spent in the Arizona desert. They never forgot the faces of the Blackwood women, the strength they found in their shared trauma, and the quiet, miraculous resilience of the children who were born into a world of darkness but who were given a chance to live in the light. They knew that their work was not just about mapping the land, but about understanding the human heart, its capacity for both unspeakable evil and for a profound and ultimately unconquerable hope. They had been witnesses. By telling the story, they had ensured that the last word would not belong to Jedediah's madness, but to the enduring power of truth and freedom.